Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Diego. He'll try playing it towards Becker. Kyle Becker to seal it. It's Sandoval, who's won the NASL championship for the San Francisco Deltas. He loves seeing the white and green of New York, and he's given this expansion franchise their first trophy.
It's an incredible way to end things. Done and dusted now. The final kick of the game is the insurance goal. Devin Sandoval, it's one of his first touches. He's clean through. And in their first year, they really pull off the most improbable victory all the way to the final, past North Carolina, past the big boys of the New York Cosmos, the ultimate David versus Goliath.
San Francisco Deltas, your 2017 NASL champions.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey there, everybody. It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that's devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Of course, we love to have you along for the ride. If this is your first time here, welcome to the proceedings. And if you are a return listener, well, glad to have you back. This week, we are going back to the round ball of soccer. Lots going on as we record this. Copa America, the European Championships, and the Major League Soccer is still playing through all of that. And we're getting ready for the Olympics next month as we record this, the tournament that's embedded with that as well. And lots of eagerness. Of course, the NWSL, sorry for the ladies, of course, playing quite well and drawing some great crowds. Of course, can't forget that. But it is a summer of soccer, as it seems to be every summer around here. And certainly we await the arrival of the World Cup, the big enchilada, in 2 years hence. But we go back to not too far long ago, the second version of the North American Soccer League, you may remember, that existed from 2011 through 2017. The clip you just heard was the final game of the final season of the North American Soccer League, where the San Francisco Deltas upset the mighty New York Cosmos 2-0 at a not quite sold out Kezar Stadium on November 12th, 2017. 7 years ago, not even 7 years ago. It seems like a lifetime away, doesn't it? Why is this important? Well, yeah, we're going to sort of delve a little bit into the second version of the NASL, but it's not really the focus. The focus is the fact that the second version of the NASL is still technically alive. Why is that? How is that, you might say? Well, if you've been following the trades, if you will, the NASL version number 2 is still embroiled in a lawsuit that it filed back in 2017 upon the league's collapse against Major League Soccer, actually the United States Soccer Federation, and claiming that the USSF, or otherwise known as U.S. Soccer, was illegally protecting the market of Division I status for Major League Soccer. Obviously, intrigue there, as MLS was founded in the early days of setting up the World Cup. The last time it was here in 1994, one of the provisions that FIFA imposed on U.S. soccer was this desire, this mandate to create or recreate a professional top-tier Division I league in the diaspora of that. And that's exactly what Major League Soccer became in 1996, 2 years after the 94 and very successful World Cup. Well, that's all part of the lead up to this, but the NASL, largely through the funding and the sole efforts of one Rocco Commisso, who you may remember was the owner of the New York Cosmos by the end of the league's existence, not for the entirety, but certainly near at the end. Rocco wanted the Cosmos to climb the mountain once again and reclaim its old status, I guess, legendary status back from the old original NASL, to get into the first division. And various efforts to join MLS were rebuffed, and he wanted to take the Cosmos and perhaps some of the other franchises in the NASL at least have a shot at such. If at the very least, having the NASL being an alternate Division I league and having opportunities to do so. As we'll hear in our conversation with our guest this week, Professor Stephen Bank, who is not only the Paul Hastings Professor of Business Law at UCLA, also is the de facto expert in all things soccer and law in the United States. You may follow his tweets on the X Twitter thing at Prof Bank, PROF Bank, at Prof Bank, where he is literally providing as real time as news warrants the lingering effects and news as it drips out on this court case that dates back all the way to 2017 when the league basically collapsed, but is still going on. And literally about 2 weeks ago, there was a latest ruling in this case, which is still very much alive, that the United States Soccer Federation must now face a trial. It's actually been determined over claims that it schemed to curb the competition for professional soccer leagues in the U.S. back in the day, not too long ago. A prime claim being that U.S. soccer insulated Major League Soccer from potential rivals, such as, in this case, the North American Soccer League version number 2. This case is full of intrigue. The fact that it's still alive and kicking is pretty interesting. The fact that it potentially can be a very interesting result that could alter the landscape of professional soccer in this country is hugely intriguing. And it is a story that continues to unfold. So I thought it was a good idea to maybe kind of get some input from perhaps the best expert on the planet around this case and what's going on with soccer in the United States legally, to kind of know, get an update and sort of like how this case sort of came about, what's at stake, what's going on, who's funding it all, and potentially what might happen, not only specifically with the case, but in the aftermath, should it be determined, or defined or decided, that's the word I'm looking for, in a number of different potential ways. So it's a fascinating discussion. It gets a little legally jargony. That's what I'm also trying to say. But it is well worth the listen. And I think you'll learn a lot, as I did. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on television. But it's really important. And it actually harkens back to a bunch of other legal issues that soccer in this country, professional in particular, has had over the many, many years. As we've talked about with our pal Steve Holroyd and others along the way. I mean, labor issues like the North American Soccer League, the original version, and their players' strike, funded by and corralled by the NFL Players Association at the time. There's all kinds of legalities when it comes to FIFA and its relationship to U.S. soccer and the international status of it in terms of overseeing the entirety of soccer in various nations across the world. The controversies around the 35-yard line and the shootout and all that kind of stuff in the original NASL and FIFA mandating that had to go away. Some internal legalities there, but does the NASL at the original NASL have a case back in the day to fight against that? And international law and domestic law and labor law and all kinds of fun stuff, all entwined in the history of soccer. in this country. But we're going to laser focus on this particular case, that being the North American Soccer League's case against U.S. Soccer and the claim that U.S. Soccer, unlawfully protected or insulated Major League Soccer in that process. And we're going to drag in a couple of other things. There's U.S. Soccer versus Relevant Sports, which has to do with the oversight of international teams and leagues coming to play games in the United States, especially during the summer. There are legalities around that. We do reach back into some of the oddities of the original NASL, and even the old ASL as well makes an appearance. And we kind of lead up in our conversation with Professor Bank about how he got interested in soccer and how he connected his professional life as a lawyer and as a professor of law into the world of soccer. And you'll find out that starts in Cleveland, Ohio. And let's get right to the conversation to find out how that indeed happened. And yes, we're going to go back and you're going to hear a couple of names of some teams from Cleveland's soccer past as a setup. So let's waste no more time and let's learn a little bit. Let's put on our thinking caps and get some schooling here on what's going on with this case and soccer in general with Professor Stephen Bank. Here's our conversation we had just last week. Please, as always, enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a little bit of background about you, the day job, but maybe even starting before, because you indicated to me in an email when we were setting this up that you actually have some early interest in the professional version of the sport too. And you even threw a few names at me of teams we haven't even talked about yet.
Yeah. So, well, I'll start with the soccer side, I suppose. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is and was certainly at the time that I was growing up a hotbed of soccer interest, primarily Eastern European, but it was kind of a melting pot of kind of Eastern European and Italian and what have you. So similar probably in some ways to like a St. Louis at that time. And for those of you who grew up in the era I did, we're talking like the 70s and the 1980s, early 80s and 70s. It was a heady period of time, but also a tumultuous period. And part of that was because of the North American Soccer League. But even before the NASL, there was a whole bunch of leagues. So Cleveland actually didn't have an NASL team. Cleveland had a variety of teams, but the Cleveland Stars and then the Cleveland, which turned into the Cleveland Cobras in the American Soccer League, the ASL. And they used to play in a stadium that is one of the first artificial turf fields, probably in all the Midwest, at Baldwin Wallace College Finney Stadium. It was basically concrete with welcome mats stitched over on top of it. It was the worst field.
Remember it well, no doubt.
So I still have scars on my one of my legs from slide tackling on Finney Stadium's field. But it was also one of those fields that had drainage, but the drainage went into essentially a ditches like along the side of it, so you literally were sliding out and falling into a ditch. But so the Cleveland Cobras, but you know, by the time I really, so I used to go to some of those games, and I was the beneficiary of having an older brother who was heavy into soccer, and he he was the guy who went in when NASL was in its big days. He went into the shoe store and got the posters of the famous players from the NASL. So I had before, after they were done with those promotions, so I had Beckenbauer posters and Chinagre posters, and so that was sort of my introduction to pro soccer. But by the time I really got knowledgeable, the league had collapsed, NASL, and in a really spectacular fashion, because as you would know as a fan of the Cosmos, I mean, they in their biggest games, they would get 70,000 people in attendance at some of their games. They had Pele, they had all the best players, and this was a period that I think the modern kind of Euro snob fan, which is basically the way a lot of soccer fans think about themselves, who follow the elite European leagues, but who actually have no history and understanding of what Europe used to look like in soccer. This is a period before, from a legal perspective, before the Bozeman case, which was the case that allowed for all these free transfers across Europe. And so European soccer players didn't get paid that much. And so the Cosmos were essentially the big prize, the big ticket for a lot of players who they made their names in Europe, but they actually made a lot of money coming over to the US. And it wasn't just the Cosmos, but in Vancouver and in Tampa Bay and all over, there's sort of a generation of US youth soccer coaches that came out of the NASL. And so in any event, but that all kind of collapsed, largely because no one could keep up with the Cosmos spending, and the Cosmos couldn't keep up with the Cosmos spending. And, it just is partly a reflection of the difference between a media and, having sort of a media deal that you have in today's sports leagues and relying on ticket sales at the time. But so my kind of high school years, really junior high and high school, it was MISL, Major Indoor Soccer League, the Cleveland Force. That was the big team. And they had players who moved over from the Cleveland Cobras ASL team, which the ASL went out of existence. And so
there were guys double dutying. It was kind of the best of times for them if their legs and their physique and their health could keep up, right? You could play indoors and outdoors and maybe have a little overlap. The ASL was even talking about doing that, literally having kind of trying to mimic maybe what the NASL did or didn't do every other year or so, is try to have a indoor and outdoor kind of thing, and players could make double the money, if you will, by playing, if you will, 2 seasons throughout the entire year.
Oh, absolutely. It was, there are players, I recall players playing on both, or moving over from one to the other for sure. And then in NASL, they did that too, as you mentioned, for a little while. And MISL was kind of indoor soccer was kind of the hot game. There was the view that was going to be the future of the US, of soccer in the US, going to these unused basketball arenas, during the kind of soccer season, and finding a way, hockey and soccer and basketball arenas finding a way to fill the gap, fill the nights with indoor soccer. Lots of great players, very different type of game. But in any event, that there was no. So this is from the end of the NASL, which is the early 80s, I think 82, 83. Until 1996, there was no what we would call a Division I professional outdoor soccer league in the US, an MISL, and then they went out of business, and the Continental Indoor Soccer League took over. But really, it was indoor soccer was the only pro game in the US. And this is at the point where I'm a high school player, recruited for college, but college recruiting was entirely different than it is today, and it was sort of who could even they get to show up there. I was a part of a soccer family, interested in the game, but really just the idea that there was any future in soccer was kind of silly.
As a player or even as a quote unquote industry, right? I mean, there's a huge. Right. I'm sure you're a little bit. I think you're a little younger than I am, but there was that huge sense of abandonment, right? I mean, these, they had the ASL and the NASL and all, and indoors, and there are 2 leagues playing indoors, and then like by the end of the decade, all of it was basically gone, and it was like, wow, it was a real trough, a disillusionment, if you will, right? And and then without that World Cup in '94 and the seeds of or the mandate by FIFA to start a league. But, in the wake of that, you wonder where the sport would be at this point.
Well, yeah, that's critically important. I mean, the one shining star I had growing up that was like, hey, there's maybe somebody could do something here, is that one of my contemporaries, although he was a few years younger than I am, but he always played up, was Brad Friedel. He played in Bay Village, which is on the west side of Ohio. I was on the east side of Cleveland. I was on the east side, but he was always playing, and he was the kind of guy who could beat you as a striker or as a goalkeeper. It didn't really matter. And he eventually went to Europe, but he went to UCLA, right? That was like the big soccer move for him, which of course is where I'm a professor right now. So, kind of a guy, but there was very few of those kinds of guys who could make it out to a big time soccer program and maybe have a chance to go somewhere where there was pro soccer, which basically didn't exist.
So you have soccer bona fides, right? So that's helpful. And I guess is always sort of, has a personal thread there as you sort of decide to ultimately go to law school and focus on law and stuff. When do those two things, that sort of professional track and your soccer, or origin story, if you will, when do those start to kind of coincide and become one and the same? Because you've over the years become your expertise is in generally sports law, right? But I think soccer has become kind of you've become a de facto expert in this specific area.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story, and I don't know if anybody would be listening to this is kind of like in the early stages of their career. I suspect it's more people who are not just starting out, but people who are reminiscing perhaps about what was. But for someone who's just starting out, it's interesting because I went into law because of course there's no real future in soccer. And when I say there's no future in soccer, I actually knew the owners of the Cleveland Force, for example, like family friends, just generally because there's not that many people involved in the sport. But so in theory you could say, well, hey, I could go work for them, but that wasn't even a thought. Like, what are you, crazy? There's no future in that. So what happened is, so I did law. I was not a sports law person per se, and really I'd say there really isn't any such thing as a sports law person. When I was developing as a lawyer, there were people who practiced in the industry of sports, but they had a substantive expertise. And so my expertise was in tax and business law. And what happened is I did some sports law in practice. I was working in Texas, in Dallas, I graduated from law school in 1994 when the World Cup is going on. In fact, I studied for the bar exam with the World Cup as my motivational technique. I said I couldn't break to watch the World Cup unless I mastered, X more principles for the bar exam that summer. But I'm right there. So in Dallas, and there was no sport, professional soccer, but my firm represented the Dallas Mavericks, and I ended up working on a lot of things for NBA work, and that's really the thing that happens in sports law. Actually, is if you do sports industry, you end up doing whatever sport is around. It's not really. It's like asking a newspaper writer, "Wow, you get to write about sports. I love sports." And the relevant question is not whether you love sports; it's whether you love writing. And in sports law was, do you love sports? No, it's, do you love law? And then is this the industry? But so I really wasn't sort of in the thought of my mind, I'm going to be a sports lawyer. I was going to be a lawyer. And anyway, work my way up into academics, and again, not in sports at all. And UCLA started this program that was teaching courses in your living room on off the beaten topic kind of subjects for 1 unit of credit, pass fail, no writing requirements, just students getting together and talking about something.
That sounds like a winter intercession thing that like small
it's
colleges
that kind of thing. Although we did it during the semester, and you do it like you meet 5 times during the semester, right?
That's cool. It still sounds cool.
You'd have dinner, you'd, in your house, it was a way to get sort of demystify kind of the process in law school, meet with a professor in a kind of an intimate setting, not behind a podium, not a scary way. And so students could kind of expose themselves and talk and get to know professors better. And by this point, I had a family and I had, had young children, and we were just fans of soccer. And when you have young kids and you've got this, you want to expose them, you both take them kind of to play soccer. We did the youth sports, but we did all kinds of youth sports. But we also decided, well, we should go to some games. So when I was in Dallas, we had gone, my wife and I, bless her heart, because she really didn't care at all about soccer, but we went to some Dallas Spurned games in their first couple seasons. But then we left Dallas and we were living I started my career at Florida State University, so we're living in Tallahassee. There was no soccer there, no professional soccer of any kind. So it wasn't until we got to LA that, I was in a town where MLS was located. And then it wasn't a few years later till we had kids that were of an age we could take them. And it just turns out that when my kids were of an age where I could really take them to games, also happened to be when David Beckham came to the LA Galaxy. So suddenly, we're going to games, kids are excited. I'm learning something about youth soccer, about the governance of youth soccer, about the affiliation with US soccer. I'm becoming a referee, I'm becoming a coach. Fast forward, I ended up coaching AYSO soccer for 16 years and refereeing and all those things. So in this course, I proposed, I'm learning a lot about soccer as it relates to the law. I knew something about sports law. I also knew something about business, and because of business and tax law, why don't I do a course related to sports and to soccer? And they approved it. The administration of the law school said, great. So I did that for a couple of years. Then the FIFA corruption scandal hit. And UCLA had just gotten a big donation of money to expand our entertainment law program to include sports, because the view of the person making the grant was that sports is the future of entertainment, right? It's not movies, it's not TV, it's sports. And of course, he was entirely right that the decline of studios is the power of studios, the decline of television stations, so to speak. The traditional old style law in entertainment law was still applied, but sports was becoming the one kind of appointment viewing shows, and so it was very important. And so they said, great, we're going to do sports law as part of this, but we don't have anybody who teaches sports law. And they looked around and they saw I was teaching this 1 unit, 1 semester, pass-fail course on law, lawyering, and the beautiful game. That was the name. And they said, hey, we got the FIFA corruption scandal. We just got a bunch of money. Can you sort of teach more sports law?
And I'm guessing they probably put you up to be the expert too for media too, Colin.
Suddenly I am the expert, right?
Yep.
But you become the expert. The dirty secret of expertise is you become the expert because someone decides you do all the reading about all this, you figure it all out, and then you teach it. That's how you learn.
Yeah, you almost volunteer your way to it, so to speak.
Exactly. And so you do enough, and this all is happening actually at a time when Twitter is taking off. And I realized that if I want to learn a lot about sports, but also talk about sports, the traditional model of academic discourse doesn't really work, because the traditional model would be I start researching an article maybe over the summer, I write it in the fall, I go to academic workshops maybe in the spring, submit it to journals. It'll come out in like a year and a half, in print, right? And if you want to talk about something that's going on now, you need to find a forum that is more current, more timely and topical. And so I ended up tweeting about some of these things. And this is about the time, not just the FIFA corruption scandal, which I ended up publishing a big, long academic article about as well. But when a lot of lawsuits started being filed. I mean, there was enough lawsuits that I could teach against U.S. soccer, that I could teach an entire course just on U.S. soccer lawsuits. It was crazy. I mean, this includes lawsuits that are through arbitral proceedings, through alternative dispute resolution processes. In the U.S. Olympic Committee, Hope Solo had a case. There was a case before the International the Court for Sport in Lausanne, Switzerland, that was challenging U.S. soccer for not having promotion relegation. All sorts of cases started coming out, and suddenly there's you just have to be in the right place at the right time. There's nobody else in the country. I mean, literally no other law professor in the country who was doing anything relating to soccer, and there I am.
Well, I think you're underselling it a little bit. I mean, because your expertise obviously is well known now and sought after, right? So, but let me get into the historical roots of this, and then we'll get into the topic at hand, this sort of NASL 2 thing, which won't die, which is intriguing to me but I do think some of the history perhaps I'm not looking for a full history of it, but I remember, the old NASL, there was this, and we did a story, we did an episode about this a couple of years ago with our pal Steve Holroyd. I think he would describe himself as an amateur historian, but he too is also a lawyer by trade. So he's got,
yes.
But there was the NASL union thing that the NFL Players Association was essentially standing up back in I would say 78, 79 or so. And there was a period of time when there was a unionizing sort of movement afoot. And it kind of fizzled. But it did, it maybe spoke to some of the issues you were talking about with the Cosmos and people outspending each other. And frankly, the players maybe not benefiting from all of that.
Yeah, and I know Steve. Steve's a labor lawyer, so he particularly focused on some of those issues. Part of the maturation or growing pains of a sports league in the U.S., but it's also the growing pains of sports in the U.S. So when you're talking about the 70s, people who played in the NBA or the NFL in the 70s also are kind of appalled today, looking back at how badly they were treated compared to the modern athletes. And so this is really a period when they are just starting to exercise their rights, just as they are in Europe, right? So this is the same idea. I mentioned the Bozeman case. Athletes all around the world were poorly treated in these early days. If you're sort of think about the images in anywhere from the 30s and 40s through the 70s, really, the image of like kind of the traveling circus, where you just are kind of housed in cages or wherever, and then you go off to place and dank, poorly lit environments, and hope to make a few bucks. It's kind of what sports was. I mean, that's overstating it certainly by the 70s, but it's kind of like the NASL. Like there were certainly big stars, but they were not treated really like big stars in a lot of ways at the time. But the NASL had certainly aspirations, and NFL Players Union did the same thing with Major League Soccer. So Major League Soccer's Players Association has its roots in the NFL Players Association, propping them up and subsidizing them really at the early days. And that is partly because there's only so many rich people who can own sports teams, and they're kind of the same people. It sort of really can burn money. And so it was almost the same battle. In fact, today, there's lots of overlap between the owners of Major League Soccer teams, the people who are running Major League Soccer, and NFL owners and the NFL governance. So very common. But NASL, there's lawsuits involving NASL at the time that imply that NASL was a more serious player than it was. But again, NASL was not ready for all that. It fizzled out in part because NASL was being propped up by a few teams that spent a lot and a lot of teams that had very few fans.
Yeah, and the old franchise thing where you just sell more franchises, and but it also too speaks to what I think is probably a thread of what we're going to get to, is this. Well, the first NASL, right, was that's the old franchise model, right? Whereas
Right.
MLS is single entity, right? This other
Correct.
wrinkle to this, right? Arguably, maybe not so arguably, concentrating more power to the man, right, who owns stuff, right? That is even a harder labor nut to crack, or maybe necessitated a unionization move maybe sooner and more forcefully even than what the NASL Players Association attempted to do back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this more. This might be overstating it, but let me state it this way: just about everything that is important to the professional soccer today, and that people complain about with respect to professional soccer today, is an outgrowth of the problems of NASL and a reaction to the problems of NASL, the NASL 1.0. That is, it's a single entity, is a structure that was created because of what happened to not just NASL, but NASL, ASL, APSL, USISL, all these leagues. You can go back farther. These leagues that never really made it, and clubs that didn't make it. So,
and from a business perspective, sorry to interrupt. So from a business perspective, not an unrational idea, right, to do that given all that history.
Oh, it was not just not irrational, it was the only way to do it. That is, most kind of old hands at this, and I'm probably fall into the old hand category, certainly old enough. Most people who are Gen X, let's put it that way, or older, are appalled at what sort of younger fans think like you should just do, snap your fingers and just do this, make these changes in U.S. soccer, because it's so ahistorical. Like the first of all, it's ahistorical in the sense that U.S. soccer has been very close to collapse in really recent history, right? The even Major League Soccer, which today is okay, it's Division I, it's the top league, was close to collapse. Probably certainly in the early 2010, 2000 to 2012, something like that, when Miami and Tampa went out of existence. Without Phil Anschutz and Kroenke and Lamar Hunt, and a few others, just essentially buying the rest of the teams in a single entity format. Major League Soccer doesn't even exist, and really, you can't apply that to Europe either, because all those leagues have been in existence for 100 years. So it's just a very different historical pathway, but it's also, you need history. You need to be entrenched.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sportswear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League, or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls? of the past, ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and it's promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, PF Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Well, I know a lot of the things that we kind of hinted at is about we kind of center sort of around the labor issues and stuff. And I'm sure we could do a whole nother conversation about, the Major League Soccer Players Union, what the referees have been dealing with, but both of them fighting back, against the sort of the hardening, I guess, of the single entity and arguably the validity of it going forward, and should it be more unshackled and all that kind of stuff. But I'm really curious about. So you're mentioning U.S. soccer. I think it's probably a good opportunity to kind of introduce maybe sort of the idea of U.S. soccer. I think most people don't sort of realize its roots as being, I don't know, not very professional until fairly recently in terms of structure and the manner by which their governance has been determined over the years, very obtuse and sort of arcane kind of process by which the people who have been elected and what they represent and stuff. And the pro game, Lord knows we could have a whole separate conversation about sort of how the pro game has evolved and its relationship with FIFA. But I'm really curious as to maybe sort of the setup here of this second version of the NASL, in name really only, because I think the parsing of what a Division I and a Division II and Pro Rel and all that kind of stuff, a lot of which is very common in other countries around the world, is not common to the U.S. exceptionalism, I guess, and seems to me to be the kind of the root of why the second version of the NASL is still sticking around in legal sense, trying to maybe prove its case, maybe empirically. There's a setup in there somewhere. Please help.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things I could jump off on that. And let me just start with one thread of that in terms of U.S. soccer governance. U.S. soccer actually, one of its major problems, one of its major challenges is that it really serves two masters, both historically and legally. So historically, U.S. soccer was for the U.S. Soccer Federation, which is the governing body, was developed around the pro game. It isn't until that's like historically, I mean, in the 30s. In the idea of a World Cup is not actually that old. The idea of international sports governance and having soccer in the Olympics is not actually that old historically. It wasn't until later that the U.S. Olympic Committee decided we need to have sports governing bodies in every sport, and we need to have those sports governing bodies need to have the power to make selections for the international and national teams, the international games and the national teams, without interference from like legal challenges. So, no antitrust relating to that. And so the U.S. Olympic Committee, but not until much, much later, had decided after what was called the Ted Stevens Act was passed, created sort of selected sports governing bodies that would be the single sports governing body for that sport. U.S. soccer was selected, but U.S. soccer is also the representative of FIFA in the U.S. And so as the representative of FIFA, U.S. soccer has an obligation over the entire game of soccer. As a representative of the U.S. Olympic Committee, it has an obligation really originally it was like amateur athletes, but which would include kind of youth soccer up through amateur because of the selection process, and not really pro sports. It has changed a little bit only because the international game, the International Olympics, as well as the international games allow for the selection of pro athletes when they didn't used to. So those two masters create kind of a conflict when you think about the entire body. So oftentimes when U.S. soccer is making decisions, and this case involving North American Soccer League is the pro side of those decisions, but on the board are also members of the Youth Council and members of the Adult Council, which includes just adult rec, essentially rec or high level rec, kind of semi-competitive level. So there's also a lot more athlete influence because if the U.S. Olympic Committee requires a high percentage of power to be given to the athletes, when you're thinking about that makes sense in certain contexts, but here we've got pro sports as well as youth sports. Who are the athletes who are making these decisions? So U.S. soccer has a difficult job. It is a membership organization, an umbrella governing body. It has some power, but not. But its power is also constrained because it is subject to all the laws relating to operation of businesses, which include something like an antitrust law, right? Which is at issue at many of these cases. So that one of the problems in U.S. soccer is it's a group where all the professional leagues get together, and yet in any other context that creates worries about conspiracies and restraint of trade under the U.S. antitrust laws, because if all the businesses are getting together in one room and making decisions, that sounds anti-consumer.
Right, and that feels to me like from the layman's perspective, the nub of this, right? So the reality, right, is that, to your point, on the pro side, right, the U.S. Soccer, what used to the U.S. Soccer Federation, essentially, back when the first realm, well, not first, but the late 1960s, when the aftermath of the 1966 World Cup, right? There were three, count them, entities, all angling to become the official Division I pro soccer league. And there's a whole bunch of reasons as to one was sanctioned, one wasn't sanctioned, but the power was theirs to give to the appropriate entity to bestow that sort of official FIFA blessed U.S. sort of Division I status. And that continues to be sort of the case. But I think in this particular case, right, the definitions of what Division I is and Division II, that's all kind of centered in the power structure on the pro side of U.S. soccer. And I'm guessing that's what is at the heart of this matter, even though that the second version of the NASL, let's call it NASL 2 for simplicity, it ran aground of these rules that seem to kind of keep changing. I think they were essentially given sort of Division II status, the NASL was, in the 2000s, and angled to potentially become a challenger Division I kind of thing to MLS. And I think that's where U.S. soccer kind of put its foot down, so to speak, and maybe is the source of the consternation that still lingers today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of facts buried in that summary to some extent, but it is, just to make one thing clear, the U.S. soccer has been doing Division I, Division II, Division III for decades. After the 94 World Cup, or before the 94 World Cup, when FIFA granted U.S. soccer the World Cup, they said, hey, you got to have a pro outdoor league. This MISL thing, or this, like indoor soccer is not going to cut it. So the professional league standards were created in 96, I believe, or 1995. Because as they're starting to think about, we have to have a pro league. Well, we have pro leagues, Division I leagues, right? But there was no real standards for what was Division I, what was Division II, what was Division III. In other countries where there is a structured pyramid of leagues, the leagues never change. Nobody creates new leagues. At least that's historically the case. I will say that Europe is changing. The Super League as an example of where the new leagues could be created, and I think actually their law is gonna coming into tension with their soccer tradition. But the European way would be, well, a club works its way up from the Division III league to the Division II league to the Division I league by winning the leagues. That doesn't exist here. And so they had Division I, Division II, Division III. What does it mean? Not clear. So after the World Cup, they create these professional league standards. U.S. Soccer creates them to provide some meat to what does it mean to be Division I league. And this is really a huge gripe of traditionalists among American football supporters, that those standards are all based on business standards. Now, it is untrue that that's not the case around the world. Just about every country in the world has, as part of its promotion relegation system, a proviso that you could be denied promotion if you don't meet certain other standards as well as sporting merit. So that's why in Mexico's invoked that many times, because they have very small clubs that don't have big enough stadiums, or don't have financial backing, all of that. But the US only has those kind of business related standards, not the sporting merit. But if you were a soccer fan in the US in 1995, who had lived through the wreckage of NASL 1.0, you're trying to think, what do we want as a Division I league post World Cup 94? Is you want a league that has a financial survivability, right? You want a league that's sustainable, and you want a league that can attract the kind of sponsors, that attract the kind of media contracts that's going to grow the sport. And so the professional league standards were created with that in mind. They are at the crux of the NASL 2.0 case, right? The legal case is about the existence of an application of the professional league standards to determine what level division you're in the US. They are primarily financial type requirements. Some of them are health and safety requirements as well, which are, a player health and safety, which is obviously important. Some of them are field related. The size of the soccer field, which Tim, you like me grew up in a vintage, but I think a lot of people today are still wouldn't know this. There's a lot of soccer games being played on fields that seem less than standard. They're not the standard size. They have lines on them. They have all sorts of issues with them, and that was true at that time. When they were creating these the pro league standards. So some of them are related to the game, the kind of how you do the operations of the game, and some of them are related to financial and size and all that. So the issue in this case is fundamentally, if you looked at it if we're starting the movie at the end, right at the beginning of the end, right? How some movies will start in medias res, but in this case, in the beginning of the end, before the last scene, it was NASL being denied D2 sanctioning for failing to meet certain pro league standards, and suing because they didn't want to be D3, because that's where they were going to be relegated essentially to D3 if they didn't meet D2 standards. So that's kind of where
they started explicitly as D2, right? This was an offshoot. I think the origination was an offshoot of some was it the USL and its sort of pre-mortal ooze, right? There were a bunch of owners who were saying they were a little worried about sort of the going forwardness of Fernando Marcos and the whole branches of trees that USL had at the time. But this was a Division II from the start kind of thing. I guess the question really is, from my perspective, and I sort of followed. I was a Cosmos fan again, because they borrowed very heavily on that brand. That was a team that was part of the league. There was almost a I guess there was a comfort/discomfort with being Division II, so to speak, I guess, of them. I think the Cosmos, again, sort of, at least from a name perspective, felt that they were just as good as some of the MLS teams. And there was even some angling of certain owners like Rocco Commisso of the Cosmos to perhaps get into MLS, but they were denied. I mean, it feels to me that not only were they ultimately, after a number of years, denied that Division II status on, I don't know, arbitrary definitions of qualification, you tell me. But it also feels to me like there was some real chafing by some parts of the NASL to kind of say, well, why do we have to be stuck in this Division II land when maybe some of us could, rise to the level of going to MLS? Maybe I'm mixing stuff up, but
there's certainly lots of elements to this, right? And obviously, when you're talking about a league, there are different teams and different owners, and so they had different stories to tell. And that's one of the problems, actually, is that you just like in NASL, they had some really strong teams like the Cosmos with maybe stronger owners, stronger fan bases. In NASL 2.0, they have the same thing. I don't even know if you could say necessarily the Cosmos in NASL 2 were significantly stronger fan bases, but they had a significantly wealthier owner who was more committed. However, that was only very late in the process. Rocco Commisso didn't come in until the Cosmos were in deep trouble.
Yeah, he was kind of
they were in fact one of the financially troubled teams in NASL in 2016. The story really starts in like 2010. So that's how long it was. Cosmos was actually a non-entity in a lot of ways, except for its sort of nostalgia.
That's fair. But the crux, though, do I have this right, though? It does feel to me, if I remember some of the story correctly, that and maybe this is part of the charges that still sort of linger, is it feels like U.S. soccer kind of started to change the rules a bit, maybe about what Division II meant, and maybe in the midst of the NASL getting its traction and stuff. And I think there was a real source of consternation. I mean, some of the things that, but it's also a real discussion about how in cahoots perhaps U.S. soccer and MLS were, almost conspiratorial. There you go.
Yeah. So let me break this down a little bit. So there are two real elements of the case. The first was really the case, and then the second is what's left of the case today. The original case was we shouldn't be subject to these professional league standards, right? The professional league standards are kind of anti-American. Why not let the market? If this is all about market, why not let the market decide? NASL can be. I mean, we have today, for example, there is no governing body for football. If XFL or whatever is it UFL now, something like that?
Yeah, UFL. Yep.
If UFL wants to say it's just as good as NFL, let the public decide that. Let the media decide that. Let But what people don't recognize is that in Europe they would say this is awful. We're not talking about on the field necessarily. UFL better than NFL. I mean, I guess you could create some kind of a competition and let's decide that. We're talking about as a business. So if the argument is that if UFL or a new basketball league or a new hockey league wants to come into existence and challenge the prominence of the main league, then fine. And there's a strong tradition of that in the U.S. The ABA was a challenge to the NBA. The American League is a challenge to the National League. Most of those were resolved in the U.S. through merger. The dominant league then acquires essentially all of the strongest elements of the weaker league. That's ironically that's how the first leagues in the FA in England was created. It was basically you had promotion relegation because they did a merger, but the weaker teams were so much weaker that they created promotion relegation because they said that was sort of a way for the weaker teams to kind of demonstrate their worth to be in the the better league. But so that it's a business question of, and that's what NASL wanted. Now take it back a ways. How do we get the professional league standards? I said we got them in 1995 when they created the league. There have been 3 major iterations of the professional league standards before this case was filed. Right, there have been some since the case was filed, but the 3 were done. One in 1995, that's the original. 2008 and 2014. Most of the time NASL 2.0 failed to meet the standards. You have to be resanctioned every year. Every league has to apply for sanctioning every year. Most of the time NASL failed. There was only 1 year, 2013, where NASL met the D2 standards. So what happens when you don't meet the standards? You apply for a waiver, and sometimes these things can be very minor, like and every league has gotten a waiver at some point. So in 2013, only time NASL didn't have a waiver. MLS and USL have had many more years where they've had no waivers, but they've had some years where they've had waivers too. Usually it's something to do with a change in an ownership group that may not meet standards, a stadium issue. It can be a variety of things. If a team moves, then suddenly they're out of balance. Something happens like that. And so NASL was getting waivers. The real problem was that NASL didn't have a clear pathway to solve their problems. They would get new teams and then they would lose teams. So the 2 major requirements that NASL continuously failed were requirements from 1995 before NASL existed. So they weren't like created because of NASL, and they were the number of teams in the league to be a D1 or D2 league, and that you had to have and that was originally it was 10 to start, and then within 3 years 12 to be a D1 league. The second was 3 time zones. Originally, the 3 time zones was intended to grow the sport, right? We don't want soccer leagues that are purely regional and call them D1 or even D2. And also your chance of success at gaining national media contracts are better if you're in 3 time zones. At one point it was 3 time zones had to be the Eastern, Central, and West and Pacific. And then they decided, well, we don't care if it's mountain, so it could be mountain, it could be one of your 3, but that's what they had to do. NASL just couldn't do it. It wasn't until their final year that they got a Pacific time zone team, San Francisco Deltas. But that's, so one is, should you have a PLS at all? And the second is the second count or the second charge in the lawsuit is, did U.S. Soccer conspire with MLS and USL to some extent to apply the standards in a way that discriminated against and kept and restrained NASL from competing, right? So those are the 2 main areas. The first one is the most significant. That is the existence of the professional league standards a violation of antitrust law? Did the pro leagues get together and say, we will create the PLS in order to keep out competition to MLS or to any other favored league? That was the judge recently granted summary judgment on that, but NASL had declined to respond to that portion of the summary judgment motion, effectively conceding it. So NASL, even though that was their big claim to begin with, have dropped that part of the case. I don't think they will appeal it unless it was a major bust, because there's no reason for them not to have contested that if they intended to appeal. That's actually the part of the case that's would be most significantly could most significantly change U.S. soccer, because if U.S. soccer is not allowed to have standards for the leagues, then you essentially change their governing status pretty
Right. And it could be a free for all and all that stuff. So what you're saying is that what's surviving then, years after the league collapses financially, for reasons that arguably were called out by U.S. soccer along the way, right? Is this antitrust thing, right?
They're both antitrust, but it's the antitrust charge that
Collusion.
U.S. soccer and MLS conspired to apply the pro league standards in a way that hurt NASL and deliberately hurt NASL and prevented them from succeeding.
All right. So to the layman then, why does that still linger and still is alive, even though the league is now 7 years, past? And I guess what is at stake? Because it does seem to me that MLS and U.S. soccer have, in the interim, although not maybe directly related to this case, I don't know, have not done themselves any favors by some of the actions that have occurred. For example, the U.S. Open Cup kerfuffle, where MLS has pulled back on teams to play in that competition. Now that's I don't, that sounds like you could add that to as a piece of evidence of collusion, perhaps, or coordination at least. The whole approach of MLS Pro Next, that sort of competitor all of a sudden out of whole cloth a couple of years ago to compete against the USL Championship, which arguably is the Division II survivor, if you will, in this pyramid in the United States. So it just seems to me, again, from a layman's and outsiders and maybe potentially or arguably fans' perspective, it seems like it's just MLS and U.S. soccer keep on keeping on. I don't know, though. It seems to me that would be ample fodder to bring to light as part of this ongoing case.
Yeah, here's the interesting thing about that, and I see that raised all the time, especially when you try to do things on Twitter. People bring up stuff, and it's more than you can really do to correct their understanding of it as a legal matter on Twitter. It's kind of not really the forum. It's not a great forum for that. It's like one step up from Reddit, right? So it's a little bit like misinformation combined with other things. So keep in mind, this is a case brought by NASL, arguing that the NASL has been harmed, right? And they have to prove that they have been harmed. So, and it was filed in 2017, right? It'll be 7 years. When trial starts, it'll be 7 years since they filed that case. So the things that happened since they filed the case generally are not in the case. Like there's no evidence about them. They're not introduced. So they're not part of the case. And especially the idea that harmed NASL is not part of the case because NASL was no longer in existence. It went out of existence. So those things have nothing to do with NASL. It's ironic, though, some of those things, because of course, the whole case implies that USL is kind of in cahoots with, even though they're not on this as a defendant. It's the cahoots that USL was working with MLS because they had this cozy relationship because they had all the reserve teams. MLS's reserve teams were in USL, and so they were getting all the deals. And so this was about USL cutting a deal with MLS to cut out NASL, right? And then what you're describing are things that USL would like to now be on, switch sides and be on NASL's argument. That actually probably helps the case in a certain sense. It's like, and it hurts them in another case. It helps MLS's case because they argue, see, we're not nobody's in cahoots. This is just things change or different policies. So U.S. soccer saying that. On the other side, it's like this is all about protecting MLS, and it just depends on what the day is as to who they're protecting it from. But those things aren't in the case. They're not part of the evidence. They weren't part of the depositions, the discovery that was created. There's a bunch of other things that are in the case that ironically have changed, and changed probably for the better for teams. but they're not part of the case, right? So I don't think those things will make it in. The issue in this case, and this is why it's a difficult case for NASL. There are some good things for NASL, but there's some difficult things. But they're all factual, which is why in summary judgment the court let the case go, because usually, and you don't win. Summary judgment is a motion that even if we take all the facts as given, we should win the case. Here, the facts are disputed, right? And so that's why it still goes forward to trial. But the problem for NASL is that they really were having trouble, right, throughout this period. Not only were they having trouble that you might attribute to a relationship between MLS and U.S. soccer through Soccer United marketing or some other unfair advantages that MLS got, which you could argue was a part of growing the game or what have you. I mean, there's arguments for U.S. soccer on that. But this was a period when NASL's major investor and its commissioner were indicted and pled guilty to criminal charges for the FIFA corruption scandal, which is just like, part of the problem they were having is mismanagement, and there's just lots of evidence of mismanagement and corruption potentially. So that's one of the problems for NASL in this case, is that they've got to show, hey, we were being targeted or singled out or being denied benefits when they were also poorly run and they had corrupt leaders.
Yeah, this was the Traffic Sports marketing entity that was essentially propping up and or significantly influencing the activities of the NASL at the time, and that was sort of the part that got caught up in it. So yeah, it's pretty clear. I mean, you're saying that while the case on its merits may actually have some true, there's some true opportunity here for it. NASL in its wobbliness didn't make itself it makes itself a very weak sort of candidate given all these other issues and stuff. And in some respects, I'm sure U.S. soccer would be pointing to that as evidence of their instability and arguably for why these rules need it. So why then, though, does it continue? Why? Well, tell the layman here why this is still what is still to be determined here, and does frankly the fact that it still exists in some form, should MLS and or U.S. soccer have something or some things to worry about?
So let me start with one more aspect of the court ruling that just came down that I think defines why we're still here, what could happen. So there were some evidentiary motions made about what documents needed to be sealed, which normally sounds like a very boring thing, like things that won't get out to the public, right, will just be kept private or redacted in the documents. The two documents where the court ruled, no, those things should be public, or at least in part. One was the agreement with Soccer United Marketing, and the other was the eventual settlement agreement that disentangled Traffic Sports from NASL. Those are two documents. They both wanted, each party wanted them sealed, like the U.S. Soccer wanted that one, and MLS wanted the sum deal sealed, and NASL wanted the traffic deal sealed. And the court said no. Though I think that those are the two reasons why there might be hope on either part, because those are the bad facts basically for both sides. But it's also why the case has legs to some extent, why someone might be interested in continuing it, and why there might be room for settlement is because neither side really wants those facts to get out. And sometimes you have to wait until you're on the courtroom steps before you can get settlement, because that's when your leverage is the highest, where, hey, you don't want that stuff to get out. You don't want to have this bad news in the press now. So it may be that things could settle, but right now, here's the reason why the case exists. It's 100% because Rocco Commisso, the owner of the New York Cosmos, is continuing to fund it. There is no NASL. There's just the New York Cosmos owner funding the litigation. And it's pretty clear. Originally, it was he had stated, like, I want to make a difference in the governance of U.S. soccer, right? I want to change things. I want to shake things up. I think this is awful. The problem is that he's dropped the major thing that might shake things up dramatically, which would be eliminating the professional league standards, right? That would change significantly the governance options for U.S. soccer. So originally, the case was a preliminary injunction, which is they just wanted the elimination of the sanctioning decision so they could keep going. That's not going to happen anymore. So what are they getting now? Money, right? So under antitrust law, you can get treble damages. So you get the damages and you multiply them by 3. That's potentially a very large number. So at its worst, if all of the damage estimates of NASL are taken on face value, which of course their experts, the U.S. soccer's experts, deny, but there's a battle among them as to what the real damages are. You're talking about bankrupting the U.S. soccer, right? So you could put them out of existence, is in theory. So that seems like more of a revenge or destruction.
Yeah, scorched earth.
Yeah, I mean I think that's where we are right now. Is it's become personal. So I think Rocco Commisso took it personally.
I mean, so it's supremely intriguing, and you're mentioning some other things that are even similarly intriguing. I just wonder, with some, which is this entity that MLS has had for years as sort of a part of the centralized foundation of stuff. They're basically the marketing arm for Copa America coming up next week as we record this, and they've staged numerous international games, all at the Leagues Cup and the touring of the Mexican national team and all that stuff, and obviously lots of revenues that come from that, arguably helping prop up, certainly in the earlier years, MLS and trying to sort of consolidate and streamline, if you will, the presentation of the sport from league to international and all together. There's many business reasons as to why that's a smart and almost genius concept and idea, but it almost feels to me that some of that potentially gets exposed in as shrapnel as part of this, and I guess it almost sounds to me like that the outcome of this case may not only be sort of important here, but perhaps the stuff that might get us to that point, which is, to your point, the discovery of some of these things that could lead to other issues.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is I mentioned earlier that like some of these developments after the filing of the case are probably not going to be part of the case. They're both pro and con developments. One of the theoretically pro developments would be, depending on your views of these things, is that U.S. soccer no longer has this deal with Soccer United Marketing. It's not they changed that arrangement, right? So, but it's potentially an embarrassing situation, or maybe a problematic situation, which could lead to reform, although they've already sort of done some things to reform it, is I guess what I'm saying. So it's possible. This is the kind of case, though, I have to say, this is a case that a law firm loves, because you've got a plaintiff who really wants to fight it, even regardless of the odds. They want to keep fighting. And that means that even if they lose, they'll appeal. And if they lose at appeals, they'll take it to the Supreme Court. It's like those kinds of things. Like this can keep going on for years. And they'll, appeal individual motions. So this is one of those things where there's also some value, I think, to NASL, to Rocco Commisso, in keeping this in the news, keeping the pressure on U.S. soccer, making it look bad. By the same token, U.S. soccer is, it can't solve the case the way it could when it was originally filed, by saying, all right, we'll give you sanctioning, or we'll do, there's not like a lot of settlement options that they can give that would reincarnate NASL.
Right. The NASL is not coming back, at
Right.
least because of any of this effort. But it's fascinating, and in our little world, right? It's fascinating because, in essence, in theory, and in spirit, in some respects, the second version of the NASL is actually still alive, so to speak, at least as an entity that's part of this ongoing case. And it to me, it's fascinating. It's intriguing. It's wrapped up in all of the sort of just crazy fabric of soccer's history in this country. Let me just ask you this other question, maybe just as a cul-de-sac to this conversation, and maybe we'll revisit it if indeed it does continue to go on and other events happen. Hopefully you'll come back and enlighten us further and deal with more of my naive questions. I'm really curious, maybe as your general thoughts, though, and we alluded to it before. Is the current status of USL now, right? So the fact that I wonder if USL will separately someday find their own manner by which to go after MLS and or US soccer, especially given what MLS has been doing with their own second division teams now, clawing back their developmental teams and putting them into their own league. The U.S. soccer, the Open Cup thing, it just seems to me like it's almost grist for another version of this at some point, perhaps maybe after this one gets settled, so as not to confuse and or conflate.
Yeah, in legal terms, what you'd say is that it would be a win for NASL if they create some precedent for even if they don't meet the legal standards for compensation, if they create some precedent that give hooks for future litigants. And so, as you said, like one of the things, USL might become a litigant if they feel like, for example, in the future, if they're denied D1 status, which they could be pursuing, it's not clear. I think they also have a divide among their owners as to whether that's where they want to go or not. Or promotion relegation options, or the U.S. Open Cup, for example, which it's pretty clear that U.S. soccer has deviated from the standards that it put in its own pro league standards, that you're supposed to be participating in the Open Cup, and they allowed MLS to get away with only halfway participating, or a third of the way participating. So there might be some precedent set up. I don't think that necessarily will come up in this case as a decision matter, but it might be activated by this case. So this case could have some real importance going forward. It's even if those facts don't all come in. But I think that the other thing that could happen, and this is kind of the more I don't know, mature, restrained, business-like way to approach this, is if U.S. soccer wants to be D1, it doesn't really need to litigate. It's more U.S. soccer, USL should just go to U.S. soccer and say, we want to be D1, and U.S. soccer will be wary of resisting because of this case. Right? They, whether this case results in success or not, it probably reveals a lot of things about how U.S. soccer does things, how it runs the ship. And so it's actually the best thing that could happen to U.S. soccer, that USL becomes successful enough that it can be legitimately a D1 league, because they want to demonstrate, they meaning U.S. soccer wants to demonstrate that we can have more than one D1 league. That is, these are not, I know this sounds odd to people, again, who follow European football. These are not limited categories. D1 is more like D1, D2, D3 is like quality assurance levels. And you can have more than one, whatever, LEED certified building. You can also have more than one D1 league, just like they had more than one D2 or D3 leagues. Which again wouldn't exist in a pyramid, in a promotion relegation system in Europe. So I do think that it will be easier to get it through in the future because of this case. And it already is probably easier to get through because I think that U.S. soccer is much more aware or cautious about how it's thinking about future litigation.
So to me, that's fascinating because it's interesting to see what USL is doing now. Now that MLS has been basically is now for television rights behind the paywall with Apple TV, Apple TV Plus, and the MLS season pass. USL is really trying to fill the void. They just announced another television deal, I think, with Telemundo just earlier this week, where they're putting games on CBS, the CBS mothership, as well as other places and stuff. It's the only U.S. pro league that's on more generally accessible television, and it's interesting. It just seems like it's all building to that some level of that eventuality where they will probably want to, in some respect, go compete toe to toe or head to head with MLS. And it's interesting to see how U.S. soccer might be hamstrung in their inability to possibly stop it. Who knows? To me, that's all really fascinating because 26 years plus of MLS. I mean, Lord knows it's been a lot of investment by a lot of people, a lot of sweat, a lot of whatever. But it's still single entity. It's still it's not there's definitely a restraint there. It's they're owner operators, not individual franchises. A lot of stuff that I think has yet to play out as the sport continues to grow in popularity, perhaps because of or perhaps despite some of this stuff. And endlessly fascinating, especially now too, as you alluded to at the beginning. Now this cross-pollination amongst sports leagues and the international effect now. I mean, you've got ownership stakes from international entities and stuff. So it seems to me, given this conversation, that you have plenty of job security ahead of you in this
Well, and
space.
we didn't even mention the other case that implicates and potentially affects all of this, which is Relevant Sports. Just settled with FIFA, but still has an antitrust case against U.S. soccer for its denial of the right to sanction of the sanctioning of foreign league matches in U.S. soil, because that is a threat to MLS, USL, NASL, all of those potential
And some, right? The some entity.
Yeah, and it is that looks like it's going forward. FIFA is going to drop the rule. And I don't see how U.S. soccer is then going to have the ability to prevent it. In which case, it's like a common enemy is the best friend of the current enemies. I think this NASL represents kind of Soccer Wars 1 or 2.0. Relevant Sports represents Soccer Wars 3.0, which is now it's a war between all U.S. pro entities and entities abroad, at least in theory. And so that might also influence how everybody's approaching this. And you could see a different way of thinking about it. I don't think it's going to ultimately be a bad thing for any pro sports league, because I think the fact that, I don't know, Real Madrid plays a game in the U.S. is not going to happen weekly. And therefore, you could still follow, Inter Miami or Orlando City and be just fine. But it does show that one of the big issues is really NASL case is a domestic battle, and in the future we're going to be dealing with global battles. And that's the future of soccer and future of sports, just like the LIV and PGA golf.
Yeah, and I guess to sort of put a bow on this, right? Could you ever have imagined, given where we started this conversation, talking about scratchy concrete in Cleveland for an ASL game, and now, I mean, just the fact that there is just so much money and so much more soccer in this country than there ever was back in that day. Could you ever imagine? I think if you were a kid sitting in the bleachers, watching those players scraping their arms and legs, in the ASL, did you ever imagine that there'd be such big battles a brewing when it comes to, the money and the importance of the future of the sport of this country, of soccer in this country. And in some respects, I don't even know if it's a happy problem, but the fact that it's of such a scale now and it's such a major sport in this country. I mean, I guess that's a slight win, and maybe the fact that these kinds of arguments exist is a testament to the fact of how much it's grown since then.
Yeah, no, it's a huge win. It's a huge win that there's something to fight about, right? Because in the old days, nobody would have this litigation because there was not enough money to fight over.
All right, many things yet to play out in this particular case. And the best way to keep abreast of that is to follow the good professor on Twitter/X at Prof Bank. That's PROF as in professor, Bank, BANK, at Prof Bank on the Twitter X thing. Stephen is also available for various commentary if you're a journalist or a media outlet and you're looking to get insight into what's going on in the U.S. soccer world legally. You can check him out on the UCLA.edu website at the UCLA Law School. And while you're online, why don't you also check out our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where we post all of our episodes. They're available to stream or share or download, do whatever you want with them. Of course, the best way is to make sure that you add us to your podcast feeds. That's the easiest way. Make sure that that's there so you can make sure you don't miss any episodes. But if you want to go back into the archives and take a look and search them up, there's a search box there. Of course, you can also go to the merch section on our website and find all kinds of great stuff. You want to get some Cleveland Force or Cleveland Cobras stuff, as potentially Steve Bank would like to go back in the day and reminisce. Well, why not get a couple of shirts and pennants and that kind of stuff? You can do that. We've got great links to awesome merchandise from our pals at TeePublic, RoyalRetros.com, as well as OldSchoolShirts.com. So have at it. Again, that's on our merch section on our website at GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com. You could also send us email. We're at hello@GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com. And you can follow us on the socials. Why not? We're on Twitter X at GoodSeatsStill and tons of other places at GoodSeatsStillAvailable, including the YouTube. What else? Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence, of course, coming to our rescue one more time, as he does just about each week. And thank you, great listeners out there, for your support and enthusiasm for our efforts. And we're going to try to add some more to those efforts over time. And we appreciate those cards and letters. And hey, thank you to the handful of folks who have bought us a coffee on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just click on that little logo there from Ko-Fi, and you can send us a couple of shekels. We appreciate that. Always nice to keep the lights on for yet another week of fun and frivolity here on the podcast. You know it, you love it, you can't live without it. Good Seats, still available, my goodness. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.